Dr. Tal Zarankin is an associate professor of management at Radford University's Davis College of Business. He received his law degree at the College of Management, Israel in 1992 and practiced law for 6 years in a private law firm in Tel Aviv, Israel. He completed his LLM in Alternative Dispute Resolution at the University of Missouri School of Law in 2003. He received his PhD in Business Administration in 2008 at the University of Missouri, specializing in the area of organizational behavior. His main research interests relate to human behavior in organizational settings, such as conflict management, individual decision-making, and teaching in higher education. Welcome, Tal, for this conversation with our MBA students, and it gives me tremendous pleasure to have you here today. In the interest of complete disclosure, let me share that Tal and I overlapped during the PhD program at Missouri, and we were office mates for 1 year, I believe, Tal, is that correct?
No, more than that even, at least
2 years? Okay, 2 years. We've been good friends from the time we met. I think we would both agree with that.
Absolutely.
I have the utmost respect and affection for Tal and his family. Of course, notwithstanding our personal relationship, please feel free to ask Tal whatever questions you want. Our goal in this interaction is for students to learn about globalization and pursuing a successful career in the global economy. In terms of structure, I will start with some prepared questions, and then we will open the floor for students' questions. Students are also welcome to ask questions in the chat box if they have connectivity issues. With that, let me start with the first question. Tal, can you share with the audience something about your current professional life and personal life beyond sort of what I've already shared?
Yes, definitely. So I think, okay, let me start maybe with something personal and then move on to the professional. With the professional, I'd like to talk about the progression of my career. I think an interesting thing is to look at people's progression, the progression of one's career. What is the role of chance? What is the role of planning? And all these kinds of things. I think that's kind of interesting. But I would like to say just welcome to everyone. It's an honor to be here. And as your professor said, please feel free to ask any question you want, because obviously I'll just talk about things that I find more interesting, but your perspective, if it's different, feel free to ask whatever you wish. So on a personal note, I will say that I'm married and have 2 girls, and that is important for many reasons, but it also overlaps with the professional aspect, of course, that your personal life and impacts your professional life in many ways. And so being an expatriate with a family is something that, we'll talk about that later, I think, but it's something that I wanted to point. I also have 2 siblings. In Israel, the average family size is 3 children per family, which also impacts many things, not just one's personal life. So I have a younger brother and a younger sister. And maybe another anecdote is my sister also does not live in Israel. She lives in London. And my brother lives in Israel, very close to my parents. I grew up in Israel and left Israel when I was 32, when I was 32 in 2002. So I've been in the US for relatively a long period of time. I will also say in Israel, there's a mandatory military service. So I started my bachelor's degree when I was 21. And I think that also has a bit of an impact on one's professional life, because I think those 3 years from the age of 18 when I finished high school till the age of 21, during the time of the military, I think I had time to sort of think about things and figure out um, what I thought then would be a good path. And I think giving yourself some time to think about things is also very important, especially at that young age. So, about my professional life, I started out as a lawyer. I started out in that career when I was about 8 years old. You can't practice law when you're 8 in Israel, but I started working as a little child in my father's law firm. And I was exposed to it since I was 8. And so, in some ways, when I later became a lawyer, it was in many ways a sort of an automatic choice. Um, and so, my career started with something philosophically, I'm not really sure it was a full choice of mine in some ways, because I was indoctrinated in that kind of mindset working with my father since I was a very small child. And after 6 years of doing that, I do feel that I took charge of my life and I decided to make a change. And in some ways, I view it as a kind of a miracle because many people do things they don't really like to do, but they do it for so long. And there's a term in social psychology called escalation of commitment, which says the more you invest in something, the more likely you are to continue investing in that thing, even though it's not the right path for you. And that's a lesson for business. That's a lesson in every aspect of your life. Don't fall into this trap of escalation of commitment. It's a very powerful trap because it's a psychological trap. It's not something we see, but it's something that impacts us because we're human beings. And so, in other words, you go to law school, you invest all this money and time, you start working, you gain experience. This momentum creates this strong force to continue, even when you realize that it's not for you. And so the miracle is I was somehow able to put a stop to it and, you know, disappoint my father maybe, and well, not maybe, for sure, and just tell him, this, I'm going to make a change, and so on and so forth. And then I felt that I need a new perspective on everything, kind of really reshuffle the deck of cards that I've been dealt with, and that's how I came to the US. And then I decided to study alternative dispute resolution because I really realized that rather than being a lawyer and fighting for clients in court, which is a very adversarial system, I decided that I was more interested in bringing people together, helping them solve conflicts outside of the court system. And so I got a degree in dispute resolution at the University of Missouri. And how did I get to Missouri? That's also not an obvious choice. Most Israelis tend to go to New York or Los Angeles. Missouri is not an obvious choice. Um, so at the time, the University of Missouri in that program was ranked the top 3 in the US. And the cost of living over there was affordable. I basically lived for 7 years with minimal income because I was able to use my savings and the low cost of living over there, and I lived pretty modestly in US terms, relatively modestly. And then after that, I fell in love with academia. The thought that I could actually work in a place where it's all about intellectual curiosity and you can pursue whichever interest you have was mind-blowing to me, that I was not um, dictated and told what to do or had a certain agenda to pursue. It was just something I couldn't turn down. So I I applied for a PhD program and I got into the PhD program, and then kind of again, one thing leads to another. I finished that and I meet Dr. Gupta on the way and learn a lot about India. And I meet other people too, learn about their countries. And then I stay and get a job and gain experience. And here I am, and 19 years have passed by.
So Tal,
So that's kind of the, yes,
your
yes,
response leads me to sort of segue into two questions.
yes,
First is you mentioned that about military service.
yes,
Understanding is that in Israel, military service is both men and women.
correct.
So please, if you could comment on that. And second, you mentioned disappointing your father and sort of working with your father and then sort of disappointing later. In Israel, is it a given that, or is it expected that the oldest child or the oldest son sort of be the father's, successor in business or work? So could you maybe talk about those two things?
Okay. About the military, I think the most interesting part of that in a national level is that it's a melting pot. It's something everyone has to do, men and women. And also today, women have almost equal opportunities as men do in the military. There are some commando units that women are not allowed to participate in, even if they physically can, but they're not allowed to. But almost everything is open to men and women. And the interesting thing, it's a melting pot. So everyone that you meet in your country went through the same experience. And that is a very powerful thing. I believe that if there's any glue among the people of Israel, it's that experience. Everyone knows what it's like. There's a common like slang and things that you do in the military. For example, one thing you learn how to do is play backgammon, the game of backgammon. Everyone plays backgammon in those 3 years a lot. So I think every Israeli knows how to play that game who served in the military. So in any way, it's a kind of a glue that, and it's a source of strength in society. Um, Not that there isn't division. I mean, as time goes by, there's different. Even though the country is tiny, Israel's population is 9 million people total. Okay, many cities in India, I think, have more than 9 million people in it. So just okay. So I think that's the more interesting part. Yeah, everyone in my family served. That we all, and it's almost 3 years. Back then, it was 3 years. Now it's 2 years and 8 months for men. And for women, it's a little less. It's 2 years, depending on what they do. Um, and about working with my father, and the second question was, is there an expectation? I don't think there's an expectation nowadays anymore, but if I think there is an expectation that if there's a family business, one or more of the children will take over the business. I think it's kind of a human thing to want, if it's a business that is a viable business, I think people naturally want their children to enjoy it or keep it going if it's a viable business. Yeah, so I think there was an expectation or a hope that I would do that. Um, and things worked out differently.
Okay. As you know, and this is sort of unrelated, but as you know, I have a similar story there, right? So,
Yes.
okay. You live and work in a country different from your native country. Can you share with us why you made the decision to do so, which I guess you already did, but how do you look back on that decision?
Yeah, this is a very complex question, actually. There's a lot here. Um, so I think if those people who believe that life can be planned out very to the smallest detail and we have a lot of control over what happens to us, I think that it's an unrealistic notion. That notion that life can be planned out and executed according to the plan is a totally an unrealistic notion. And COVID taught us exactly that. Let me give you a small example. In the US, there is a break in the spring semester from January to April, to the end of April. It's called spring break. Maybe you heard about that. And it happens in March. So in March last year, I went to Israel for 10 days. I packed a few pairs of underwear, two pants, a few shirts, 10 days. I came back to the US in January, almost a year later. We can't, my wife and my daughters were supposed to come here in 4 days. Yesterday, they found out they can't fly here because even though my wife is fully vaccinated, my girls are under 16. They were not vaccinated, and they came out with a policy that you can't travel if you're not vaccinated because you may bring back COVID and mutations and all kinds of. Anyway, life cannot be. So when I thought going to the US, here's what it would look like. I would go to the US for 2 years, gain experience, learn another culture, and culture is the biggest word and most important word in my answer here that I'll talk about soon. And then I'll come back and find a job in Israel and use all the important knowledge that I learned. I mean, by now, my story, I've already told kind of my story, didn't work out at all according to my plan because I'm still here and it's been 18 years. So not the 2 years are not quite 18 years later. So what I want to say is working in another country is a very, very big decision. Its consequences are not known to you at the time that you make the decision. I think you have to accept that as a as a as a truth. At the time you make a decision, you have an intention, and the outcome of the decision is unknown to you. Okay? Now, I think culture is a key when you make a decision like that. You have to examine the culture where you're going to, and there's a lot of research about cross-cultural, and I'm sure in your class, do you go over Hofstede and things like
Yeah,
that?
we talked
The
about half
Globe,
today, Globe.
yeah, Globe, and all these. So I think those are some very, very useful tools. Um, Geert Hofstede, I think, passed away a few years ago, but his
Right.
website lives on, and it's an incredible resource to get a broad. You have to be careful not to stereotype. Of course, not every American that you would meet would fit Hofstede's profile, but it gives you a broad overview of if you met 1,000 Americans, it should be very close to what Geert Hofstede found, or all the different researchers in the Globe Project, which is more of a compilation of studies. But talking to people, reading about the country, and learning about the culture. For example, let me tell you two things that I found out. Okay, so before we moved to the US, we traveled in the US as tourists 9 times over my life. Because when I was a little kid, my father studied at the New York University, NYU, got his MBA, just like you are getting your MBA. He got his MBA, and I was already 4 years old. So we lived in New York for 3 years, and then they went back to Israel after he got his MBA. So I lived there as a little kid. I traveled 9 times over the years because we had friends from that time. We lived there, my parents, and they took me when I was a teenager, and then I kept going. And there are things that I learned only when I lived here, and I didn't know them. 9 times I traveled all over this country and didn't know. um, there is a bit of a culture shock when you move to a different country. We have time for a little anecdote, Vishal?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll tell them a little short story from my first visit at Walmart. You're familiar? You have Walmart in India?
People in India know about Walmart now.
No. Yeah.
Walmart has been trying to expand into India.
Okay. So, I mean, you know about the phenomenon from a business perspective, but in Israel, when you buy a watermelon, they let you taste the watermelon first. I think you know where I'm going with this, right? They always let you taste the watermelon. Buying a watermelon without trying it out first is seen as a huge risk in life. Okay. So the second day we land in the US, where I went to buy groceries, I go to Walmart and I see a big box full of watermelons, and I'm looking for the person who will cut out a piece and let me taste the watermelon. Okay, and I found a person. It's not easy to find a person. I found a person and asked to taste the watermelon. The reaction was a mix of pity and surprise. They thought I was a little not normal person, okay? They said, you know, we don't cut watermelons, but there's some, they had like a quarter watermelon already sliced. You can buy that and see if you like that. Okay, so I took that. And then I go to the cash register and the person says, did you find everything all right, as they do here? And I said, actually, here's what happened with the watermelon. I started telling my story that I had some problems. I couldn't find this, I couldn't find that. And again, a look of surprise and pity, as she didn't really expect an answer, okay? And then she asked me, paper or plastic? I didn't know what she meant by that. I thought, in the American movies that I saw, plastic means credit card. The word plastic means credit card. It's a slang. So I thought I was being knowledgeable, and I didn't have a credit card yet. So I said paper. And I thought, well, paper must be cash, right? If plastic is credit card, paper is cash. And then they started packing my groceries in paper bags, but I didn't want that. I said, no, I don't want these paper bags. They're going to tear. Give me like these other bags. And they said, but you said paper. So the point is, even going to a grocery store when you just moved to a new country can be an embarrassing and confusing situation. And so you have to sort of ex expect that if going to a grocery store will be confusing, doing business and working in a company is going to be more, I mean, confusing at a professional level as well. I don't know what's worse, but it's two different things. So it's very important to be very observant when you move to a new country. Look at what other people are doing. Try to learn from what you see around you, and expect unintended consequences. If you're going to have a family, children, they'll be embedded in a different environment. Are the values compatible with your values? How will you preserve your culture? How will you interact with your colleagues? You know, close to where I live here in Virginia is the only Volvo, the automaker Volvo, is the only factory for Volvo trucks in the US. We take operations management students. Vishal, you would have loved that to see the Volvo factory. Um, we do strategy and operation managers. We take them to that factory. most of the top level management in the Volvo factory are from France and Belgium for some reason. They're French speaking. And I had a student from Brazil who worked there. Now, in Brazil, personal space is very, very close. It's a high contact culture. People stand very close. But in Belgium, France, and the US, personal space is much, much larger. So he used to tell me initially he would approach his manager and the manager would go back and they would sort of move as they speak because personal space, it's like a magnet with two pluses or two minuses. Working in another country sounds like a great experience. To sum it up, working in another country can be a very informative, horizon broadening experience, but the unforeseen consequences and implicit difficulties are underrated. In other words, people they romanticize the whole thing. And of course, sometimes the money plays a role here because you can earn a higher salary than most places in the world. But my strong, strong recommendation for everyone who's thinking about it is to think about unextended consequences and do extensive research before you embark on that potentially life-changing experience.
And Tal, I completely uh, agree with you on that. As you and I have discussed this issue several times personally, there's many, many unintended consequences of living and working abroad that one doesn't think about, uh, perhaps because we don't sort of get asked to think about them, but you only realize sort of after the die has been cast, and then it's often too late. Moving to the next question, you talked about one strength of the Israeli society and life, which is the military service. Could you talk about sort of anything else that you think is a strength or the downside of Israeli society and life?
Um, a downside, um, yeah, I think unfortunately, Israel has, in strategy terms, maybe has lost a bit of its competitive advantage over the years. Israel started as a very collectivistic culture. Israel was also under British mandate for years before that Ottoman mandate, but the British government prohibited uh, settlement in Israel. And Israeli Jewish people who wanted to come be Israelis snuck in literally in little boats and started these communes, shared communes, the most collectivistic form of living you can imagine. And that was a big source of strength. Over the years, the format is becoming more individualistic, like in the US. And I think we're becoming more fragmented. Such a small country cannot afford to be so fragmented. I think that's a big source of division, and that's a downside of Israeli society. We have ultra-Orthodox who almost don't want to participate in many important things in Israel, like they oppose serving in the military, and they they're not very productive in terms of professions because they devote all their time to their religion. That's one big source of problem. There's the Arab population within Israel who get full rights, but many times are loyal to their people they view as their people, Palestinians and other people who are in conflict with Israel. So that creates another issue of loyalty to the country. So I would say fragmentation is the downside. Uh, I think another strength are strong ties with different countries, and that brings me to the relationship with India, among other countries. Israel has strong ties with some countries, and it's not in the news. In other words, it's kind of like a more of a quiet thing. You don't really hear about it so much. Just the relationship with the U.S. People identify Israel with the U.S. Always, and that's an important one for Israel. But I think Israel and India have a very strong relationship, especially with Prime Minister Modi, but even before. There's a lot of cooperation. Israel is also on a personal level. I have not met and know anyone who doesn't think India is an amazing place. On a personal level, it's a huge tourist attraction in Israel. And I'm not just talking about Goa or these things. I'm talking about people view it as a spiritual country, and I'm sure many Indian people are not spiritual, so many are, like every country, but it's viewed as a peaceful place, as a fascinating place. Everything about it, the food, people's the values, so it's viewed extremely positively, and I think that's an important relationship. I think that's another strength, Israel's relationship with various countries around the world.
So you've already sort of answered my next question: how is India viewed in Israel and by Israelis? So I'll ask you another question, which is: in talking to you, I often get the sense that family is very important in Israeli life and society. Could you maybe speak to that briefly?
Yes, I would say thanks to the size of the country, which, just to give you a sense of, I think that at least 80% of the population, 80% of the population live within 2 hours from each other. I don't know if you can grasp that idea, but that means people see their friends and family all the time, all the time. Everyone I know lives within a short driving distance from their family. A short, I mean 30 minutes, that short. Not hours with the train and flights. No, it's very, very short. That enables people to really be in touch, not via Zoom and phone call, but face to face in the same room. I think we'll never, I don't think anyone ever would say there's nothing like face to face interaction. I mean, there's a dimension that's just unreplaceable, right? Family is very important. Respect and taking care of the elderly, your parents. Another personal note, my mother-in-law passed away a few months ago, and because I was stuck, quote unquote, in Israel because of the pandemic, I was able to be there for my wife, and she was able to be there for her mother. And for us, this was a priceless incident. There's no money, no salary, no profession, nothing that was more valuable than being there for a loved one, a mother, especially a close one, a close person in their time of need. So yeah, family is the main value. Larger families, 3 kids and up. I think it's definitely the birth rate in Israel is among the highest in the world. In Europe, many countries have a negative. Of course, in China now they're getting a little bit more, closer to 2 in average, so it's more than 1. What is it in India, by the way? Is there like an average, or is it regional, or?
I think most families, I think, would like to have 2 or 3 children.
Yeah.
But I don't know what the numbers are about the average. That is actually, what is on the ground. But on that note, I'm going to open this to the students for questions.
Excellent.
So students, any questions? We even have a team of students who did an assignment on Israel recently.
Oh.
So yeah, any questions?
Hello, sir. Hello,
Sir,
Mr.
this
Tool.
is
Yeah.
Yes, sure, go ahead. I'll ask my question later.
Okay, okay. Sir, this is Ishwar, and I would like to ask a question that you pointed out. Really important point that uh, uh, in the in this in actually Israel, people live within 30 minutes distance. Uh, so in the era of Facebook, Zoom, and other social media, uh, in the social media, do you think these kind of values are getting lost, like a meeting face to face and all these things? Is there any tectonic shift happening in Israel as well as across the globe? I just wanted to know your view.
Yeah, I think definitely children have a different childhood these days. Absolutely. I think it's a generational thing. But yeah, I think there is a trend of communicating via Instagram, TikTok, and all these things. Um, there is that trend. People use WhatsApp for professional and personal use. So talking, actually calling, the phone is not used for making phone calls anymore. The phone is used for apps and social media. So absolutely, my perception is, it's not my area of research, so I can't say from research, but my perception is definitely there's less face to face, but there is a kind of a holy thing or thing like that people are very feel very strongly about of all ages, is there's a family meal once a week on a Friday, and that is very important to a huge part of the population. But on day to day, I think you're right that there is a trend of less face to face, more via WhatsApp or other social media. Yes.
So yes,
Sir, just a small question. Do you think that this is going to continue and it will be like, is it better for the business or the society in entirety, or whatever is happening is good? Or I just wanted to know, is it good or bad? Like, that's what I want to ask. Because most of the Indian IT companies I am seeing, 90% of their people are now working from home. So and they are finding value in it. They don't have to build a big buildings. They don't have to run ACs, and they are saving a lot of cost. But is it really good? If I ask, like, is it really good for the society and for a business in the long term?
Okay, yes, you pointed out cost savings. The divorce rate also spiked. The domestic violence spiked. Depression spiked in times of COVID. This is not just in Israel, this is in the US too, which is a much larger pool of sample. So here's my answer. I think it's like a bell-shaped curve. Okay, things in life are never linear totally. I think life is full of bell-shaped curves. I think there will be a point at which uh, people need a purpose. They need to wake up in the morning, wear something, not stay in bed and work underneath the blankie with just a t-shirt or something. They need to go up, wake up, take a shower, shave, wear professional attire, go somewhere, do something, and then come back and share how was my day with my spouse and my kids. Being at home all day has a psychological effect that is proven to be hard to manage at this point for human beings at a personal level. So yeah, I agree. They don't we don't need all the office space. And there are some questions. In Israel, there's a big high-tech industry. Maybe the group who did their project, it's Israel is called a high-tech nation, startup nation, because of the of startups in Israel relative to the population. And so people, all these high-tech buildings, WeWork and other shared space offices, they're empty right now. But this is because of the pandemic. My prediction is, as soon as the pandemic is behind us or it's under control, it'll be more like getting a flu or something for everyone, a minor disease. People will want to go back to work. My older daughter, hated going to school, hated for years. She didn't like going to school. They go to school when they're not supposed to right now in Israel. They kind of sneak in and go to school. So I hope I answered your question. I think financially there are cost savings, driving to work, accidents on the way, getting to work, the building, the electricity. But I think people are not meant to spend 24 hours a day with their spouse and kids. Maybe, but at some point it becomes you need a variety of people, settings, go outside, breathe air, see other people. So that's what I think about this. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Yeah.
There was another question, Shashank.
Yes, sir. Hello, Mr. Tal. So my question to you is, you just mentioned now that Israel is known as the startup nation, and that's correct. And my question is, do you think the experience of mandatory military service leads to Israelis developing a culture where there is a lack of power distance and maybe a bit more responsibility being taken up by the citizens? They're a bit more assertive, and that is why Israel has so many tech startups and I mean, you mentioned like there's 9 million people in Israel, and still it has so many startups. So do you think it leads to a culture where people are a bit more assertive?
Yes, I do. It's an interesting that you said that it leads to less power distance, because when people think military is a very high power distance setting, it's the most, you wear your power on your sleeve, literally. You have a rank and it's displayed on your sleeve. So you would think when you're indoctrinated to sort of, salute people, and he's higher in rank than me, you would think maybe there will be a spillover effect in society. But as you said, Israel is ranks the lowest in the world in power distance. I think that's a really, I don't know how to explain that. What I can say, because it's counterintuitive in some ways. When you think about it, you would think it would be a very hierarchical society because of that military experience, which is the most hierarchical setting you could imagine. But no, as you said, Israel is extremely low in power distance. Everyone is first name basis. Everyone is equal. When a police officer stops you, you don't have to freeze and lift your hands like that. Be careful. You just go out and talk to the police officer like you would with a seller in a spice market. It's just everyone is viewed equal. It's no big deal that you're a police officer and I'm this and that. I think that the relation with the military, or that with the startup that you asked about, I think if I can find a relationship in the military, you have to improvise a lot. That was my experience, because things never go according to the plan. When you're in the field, just like in life and in business, you have the best plan. And it's good to have a plan, a business plan and a plan. It's good. It puts you in, it starts you off in a right track. Maybe it gives you some confidence that you know what you're doing. But then on the ground, things just completely, things just kind of change and you have to improvise. And when you're in the military and sometimes your life is at stake, you do your best job to improvise very well. And so you kind of learn how to improvise. And maybe that translates into high tech. I think Israel has little resources, okay, as a country. It's not an extremely wealthy country. It's getting, I mean, it's not a poor country, but there are limited resources there. There are not many natural resources. Water is scarce. There's lots of water issues, which, by the way, entrepreneurs solved almost that problem entirely by desalinization of the Mediterranean seawater. If I'll tell you something that may shock you, 70% of the water consumed in Israel is Mediterranean seawater that were desalinized. 70%.
Hmm.
That's a huge industry in Israel now. And it's not just monetarily, it's a huge resource that we generated from the natural resource. But yeah, so to answer, just summarize my answer to you is, maybe there's a relationship with the military that you have to improvise in the military, and then that translates over. Another thing is we grow up with limited resources, and when you have limited resources and you have to reach a very significant result, then you have to be creative. So I think maybe that trains people to be innovative, and that's my best thought about that. Interesting questions.
Other questions from the class?
Yeah, hi, Tom.
Hi.
This is I actually have same question on similar lines. Since most of the people have here and there worked in the military in past, so this kind of like from our perspective, the military is something like a highly disciplined, timely, which gives you a completely routine kind of thing in your life. So does that help in making while in decision making, like people don't questions much? Because in India there is a kind of belief that people intentionally or unintentionally keep questioning and get things delayed. That's why we do not meet an SLA, and there is a tendency that whatever we time is committed and whatever is delivered is not fulfilled. So are there such challenges in Israel as well?
So if you look at Hofstede's research, Israel scores highly on uncertainty avoidance. And so what that means is that Israeli culture is not tolerant of uncertainty. And so I would say people are cautious. In the peace agreement arena, Israel, this is a good example of the influence of that cultural feature. And what happens in Israel is whenever there's some peace negotiations, Israel demands to have like pre-talks, and they send people to kind of feel out the other party before the negotiation starts. That's an example of a low tolerance for uncertainty. Israeli culture, I guess most people would want to minimize risk at some point, which kind of goes against the whole startup thing. You know that entrepreneurs, your professor knows better than me, entrepreneurs have to fail a few times before they make it. So it's kind of if they make it. So I think to answer your question, and again, you mentioned the military, but I don't quite find a relationship. In the military, you have to make intuitive and quick decisions sometimes, and you have to make very like there are also long-term decisions. But I think the culture as a whole is you have to check very well, and you don't take huge risks. The high-tech sector and startup sector, maybe it's just different, okay? But that's about 7% of the economy, right? It's not the majority of high-tech. It's not, Israel is not the majority, is not high-tech. It's a very advertised and visible side, but it's not the majority of what goes on. There's a lot of real estate. There's a lot of other things. But yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Yes, Tal, definitely.
Tal, we have a student in the class who loves history, and he has
Yes.
a question to you about history. Joe, you want to go ahead?
Yes, sir. Hello, sir. Sir, I would like to apologize if my wordings or the way I speak might hurt a few sentiments, because the literature on Israeli history or on Judaism in India is very less. So with the limited knowledge, I would want to ask this question. Sir, if we see, Judaism is almost 3,000 years old, and in a way, Christianity and Islam came out of Judaism. These two religions were from Judaism. I would like to compare this Western religion to the Eastern religion of Hinduism, where similar religions such as Buddhism, Sikhism, or Jainism have came out of Hinduism. So my question here is, in Eastern religions, among these four religions, there is no kind of friction as such. But when I look at the Western monotheistic religion, there's always a friction. And my other question is, throughout the history, what are the reasons for anti-Semitism which is observed in Europe or in Israel?
Okay. And again, this is not my field of expertise, but I'll do the best I can do to answer without hurting anyone's feelings.
Sure, sir.
Yeah, religion is a hot topic for some people. It's not for me, but it is for many people. Okay, Judaism, which is my heritage, right? It's my culture, is not a very tolerant religion. And here's what I mean by that. In the Jewish tradition, the Jews are the chosen people. That in and of itself, and that's what the Bible says, that God chose the Jews among all the other religions to be his like disciples, and he would take them to the promised land and all that. So when that is your ethos, you are above everyone else, right? If that's what you believe. If you're the chosen one, everyone else was not chosen, and you're above everyone else. That cannot be a good thing if you want to bring together people of different religions, right? And the other religions that you mentioned have similar notions in their religion too, that they're kind of above, and their prophet or God is the prophet or God, right? If there's only one, then the other is not the one. Just by default, there can only be one. If there's only room for one, then that in and of itself, it creates friction. As far as anti-Semitism particularly, I think it's a combination of two main things. Obviously, as the Jewish people went through a Holocaust, and so this is something we think about and remember every year with a special day, and we ponder about this issue. Why? Why did this happen? I think there are pragmatic reasons and spiritual reasons. The pragmatic reason is, I think, let's talk about Germany, because that's where the big atrocity happened, okay, in World War II. There were pogroms in Russia too. I'm sure you maybe heard about that. And many Jews fled from Russia to Israel in the beginning of the 20th century because of what they called pogroms, anti-Semite violent actions. But the big event, the Holocaust, happened mostly because in a broken economy of Germany pre-World War II, the broken economy, the Jews were very successful. They were bankers, they were successful traders, and there was a sense that why are those, and combine that with a religion that sees itself as like better than other religions, and it's very hard to convert to Judaism. It's very hard. It's a club that's kind of closed. It's a closed club. You can convert to Judaism, but it's very difficult. It's not a very open club, so to speak. So the combination of being quite successful amidst a failing economy and being this exclusive club it created, that's a good target for us. Let's ignite and our economy. I'm talking the Third Reich in Germany and pre-war. Let's ignite our economy, start manufacturing bombs and planes and all that, and push the economy. And let's choose this target. And I think around the world, there may be a combination of some sort of that combination in other places as well. Otherwise, it's hard for me to explain anti-Semitism. I think those two reasons may be, but I don't know. That's just my kind of like a common sense or my notion of thinking about this for years. I hope I answered. Yes.
Tal, my sense is anti-Semitism similar programs or programs were also in Spain, Portugal, and many other European countries. Isn't that correct too?
Yes. Yeah. And yeah, absolutely. In Spain, there is a big community that we call the expelled from Spain, the people who were expelled from Spain. Yeah, it happened. I just took Germany because that was the most massive organized crime against humanity that ever happened. There were other atrocities. Yeah, but I think the combination of maybe a more successful group and a more like not an inclusive religion, that kind of like a close, that created this animosity. I don't know. I think.
Okay. So Tal, now we are, we've exceeded our time with you, and I want to bring this to a close with a question, which is, you have so much experience as a lawyer, as a professor. You meet with young people from, Israel and US, of course, but around the world. What advice would you offer to our students who will be graduating soon to work in a globalized world?
Yes, and first of all, again, I want to congratulate you for this journey. I think you're doing an amazing thing. Try to meet as many people as you can, learn as much as you can, but look for the core of who you are, the core values that you have. Make sure that whatever you do in life is true to your core values. I think that is a very, very important thing, because that will be always serve as a compass to you in your professional and personal career. You can't really separate the two. Wherever you go, you take your personal life with you. And so take as much as you can of the experience, but always figure out what are those core values and stay true to those core values. That's my best advice to you.
Thank you, Tal. On that note, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to our students, and we greatly appreciate your spending time with us.
Thank you. It was an honor, and good luck to everyone. I wish you the best of luck and success.